Natalie would.
You know, I really never studied that case either. Well, I need to look at it.
I think he's asked.
How did the frog die?
May never look fun.
He Kermit suicide.
Suicide, oh no. You don't get it?
I get it.
The Lone Ranger woke to see his tent blown away by a tornado. He declared, "Tonto, we're not in canvas anymore." Oh, man. They're so bad.
That's all that makes them funny.
Okay. We have arrived at chapter 10 of Hebrews. I know. It's just taken, what, 8 months? All right. Let's get over there. And we'll probably be able to get through it. Notice I made a new background up there. Mm-hmm. All right, Hebrews 10, we're going to start with verses 1 through 4. And this is one of my favorite topics because we really get into legalism versus faith, which really, I mean, if you think about it, the whole book of Hebrews, the majority of the New Testament actually is combating legalism. But it says in verse 1, the old system of living under the law presented us with only a faint shadow or a crude outline of the reality of the wonderful blessings to come. Even with its steady stream of sacrifices offered year after year, there still was nothing that could make our hearts perfect before God. For if animal sacrifices could once and for all eliminate sin, they would have ceased to be offered and the worshippers would have clean consciences. Instead, one was not enough. So by the repetitive sacrifices year after year, the worshippers were continually reminded of their sins with their hearts still impure. For what power does the blood of bulls and goats have to remove sin's guilt? And we started on it last week as well. There's several things that are important in this passage. The first one is the law, which if you look in the original language, it's the 5 books, the first 5 books of the Bible. So it's referring to the Torah in the Greek, and it was a shadow of the reality to come. The reality to come was the Word in flesh.
Right.
So where the Father released the Word on tablets of stone, there was an agreement between Him and the pre-incarnate form of Jesus that Jesus would become a man. So the Word was in the beginning, the Word was God, is God, will always be God. And so where the first covenant was a literal tablets and law given, the second covenant was God became man. Okay? And so that's the comparison. So when you think about it, the giving of the Torah was a picture of Jesus Christ. And yet people today make the law as something that you have to fulfill, something that you have to follow, and all the washings and the foods and all that stuff. But it was but a faint shadow. Notice he said faint. The word shadow in the Greek is a faint archetype which foreshadows a later reality. It was supposed to be a glimpse into what was coming. That one day blood would be shed, that instead of reminding you of an impure heart, guilt, the punishment that's due you, it would remove all the guilt of sin. And then when I think, okay, so like if you, again, talk to many believers today, a lot of their decisions are done out of guilt. So even relationships, even decisions in their personal lives, but especially in their relationship to God. Jesus came to remove guilt. In fact, He not only declared us not guilty when we accept Him, He took us to a state of innocence, right? So all of your decisions should be made out of a place of identity in God and relationship with God, not guilt. So that's why, like, I really don't think I do anything out of guilt. Of course, part of that could be I don't feel it very much. But maybe in the young days I would do that, say yes because I didn't want people mad at me or, things like that. Now I really don't care. But guilt is not a good motivator because Jesus came to remove that from us. The only time you should feel guilt is if you do something wrong and Holy Spirit's like, hey, you shouldn't have done that. And then you get it handled and then you're back into that place. You actually never leave it. But your emotions, your soul can be restored back into a place of right relationship. So it's really important to live from that because that's what Jesus Christ died for.
Well, and I think too that let's face it, we all have a limited amount of energy and attention, and if you're diverting that and pleasing man,
yes,
then it's hard to, actually put your attention where it needs to be.
And if all of your energy and attention is going to guilt, then when you get in God's presence, you don't feel Him. You can't connect with Him because it's like a wall of separations right there. And He doesn't like it. He doesn't like it. Again, if you do something wrong, He will tell you. Other than that, you just need to trust that you're His child. That'd be like Kent not being able to come to me because he did something wrong and he's acting all weird. You know what I'm going to think? I'm going to think I did something. Now, God doesn't think that way because He knows he hasn't ever committed any sin whatsoever. But it just causes this weird dynamic in the relationship, and that means that if a parent and a child are not connecting, then the parent is going to want to find out, okay, what's going on in the child to get that eliminated. But if the child keeps that separation there, the parent's helpless. The parent's powerless. There's nothing that parent can do. And it's the same thing with father.
Don't you think that probably is the start of a lot of mental health issues?
Absolutely. And then I also think it's part of the reason why a lot of Christians remain immature. Because it is impossible for you to know who you are if you don't know who your father is. Absolutely impossible. You have to see Him as He really is. And unfortunately, religion and a lot of even sermons that are preached have preached a father that is not accurate. So a lot of people relate to Him as an orphan versus a child. Or like we've always said, they think they're still sinners, which is not true. Because a sinner has a guilty conscience, right? It's saying right here, for what power does the blood of bulls and goats have to remove sin's guilt? And so this is a key scripture.
Strip it on down.
Scripture. For those that feel that they need to observe a shadow instead of the reality. I'm very plain on that. If you think that you're supposed to follow the Torah and you're supposed to, you got even people that say they're Christian want to sacrifice lambs. I can't think of a dumber thing you could do actually, because Jesus Christ was the lamb once and for all. So for you to think that you have to sacrifice a lamb in order to fulfill the law, then you're negating that the lamb who has come to save the world wasn't good enough.
An insult.
You might be going to hell. Maybe you should read Hebrews chapter 6 actually. Right. To count the blood of Jesus as common is a big mistake. So people that feel that they have to follow the Torah, and they have to do the Sabbath, and they have to do this and all of that stuff, they're adding to the new covenant something that Gentiles were never supposed to follow in the first place. That was never supposed to be on us. But you have entire groups of people who claim Jesus Christ that follow that stuff. And you know what I've noticed about those people? They're rude. They're condemning. They ain't nice at all. You can't talk to them. You can't have fun. God forbid you tell a joke. But you know what I mean? They're just sour-faced lemon suckers, and they're not fun to be around. You know how you know that you know you're righteous? Here's a key. If you love righteousness and you hate unrighteousness, you are the most joyful person in the room. If you are living from a conscience free from guilt, you're the most joyful person in the room.
Well, it's the real peace.
Well, it's in Hebrews. It says, Jesus hated unrighteousness, but loved righteousness more than all of his companions. Therefore, he was anointed with the oil of joy. So all those lemon sucker legalists, you know, if you're not joyful, if you're not happy, then maybe you should reevaluate how you're living. You never add to Jesus Christ. It is finished. That's who he is. You never have to add the law to following him. In fact, it causes you to fall from grace. And really, it's a waste of time to observe a shadow versus a reality. Now, I'm going to read Colossians 2:13 through 17 in the English Standard. I have like key revelations in my life, and this is one of them. When I read this, it was kind of like one of those, moments where you're by yourself, and you're all, what?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how it was. This is one of them. It says in verse 13 of Colossians chapter 2, and you who were made dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven all of your trespasses. Okay, so all this can believe that. Then he says in verse 14, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands, this he set aside, nailed it to the cross. Verse 15 is key. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to an open shame by triumphing over them in him. Now, we got to pause for a second before we read verses 16 and 17. How did he put them to an open shame? Y'all see that? This is so key. He put them to an open shame by canceling the record of debt and nailing it to the cross. Therefore, verse 16, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance is Jesus Christ. Okay, here's the revelation. This is what I want to get to. Rulers and authorities, so the demonic forces in the atmosphere, right? The power they had over man was the law. Once he took that and he nailed all of its requirements to the cross, he stripped them naked. That's what disarmed means. The only power the enemy has over you is if you come into agreement with his accusation. You have to believe that you're innocent. Again, if you did something wrong, all you have to do is agree with that. Father, I treated that person rudely. I ask that you forgive me, and then you move on. That's it. Everything is taken care of. We get into trouble when we start looking at everything that's wrong with us, everything we've done wrong. We start hearing all the accusations. I did this, I did that, I treated them wrong, I blah, blah, blah. All of this stuff occurs, and what it does is it actually arms the enemy. If you try to follow Jesus Christ by following the 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, then you have rearmed principalities and powers.
Yeah.
It goes back to 1 Corinthians 15:56. The power of sin is the law. That word power is dunamis, or where we get the word dynamite. In the original language, it is the supernatural power of God or the enemy. Because he has supernatural power too, right? So when you start trying to follow the law and add it to Jesus, you're actually putting the Lord to a shame. You're rearming principalities and powers, and ironically, the very thing you're trying to eliminate, which is the consciousness of sin, by keeping the law, you actually amplify it, and then you find yourself doing the very thing that you hate. We know that because that is the life that Paul described as a Pharisee of Pharisees in Romans chapter 7.
Right.
So following the law actually empowers sin. That's why it's so important to not do that. So when we look at this, we're seeing that all the legal demands, he got rid of it. He not only fulfilled the law, he hung on a tree, because cursed is the man who hangs on a tree. So he hung on a tree to take the curse for us. Then he took our punishment on the cross, and then he was resurrected so that like any will is kicked into effect once the person is dead. By his death, he kicked into effect the covenant of Jesus Christ. So we are free from rituals and Sabbaths and meats and new moons and all of that stuff. Is it plain? I want it to be extremely plain, because it's almost like every time a person becomes a Christian, they think that they have to add the law. I did it. Everybody does it. Everybody does it. Because it makes you feel good.
Yeah.
Like I was telling them,
Performance-based.
it is performance, and we're used to performance. We're used to performing in school to get A's. We're used to performing for parents so we don't get in trouble. We're used to performing on our jobs so that we can keep our job. I mean, all of our life is basically performance. But there's one place where it's not, and that is with God. There's only one thing that pleases him.
Faith.
Faith. It takes more faith to believe you're righteous now than not.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Because we know how we are. It takes more faith to know you're righteous than to not believe that you are. And the one thing that offends God is unbelief. When I did work with junctions, and I'd work with addicts that were, they didn't want to go back to addiction. And so I would sit with them in my office. I could see all kinds of great things, beautiful people, strong people that went through terrible, terrible things. And they're still alive. A lot of people would have committed suicide. And I remember I would talk to them the things that I saw, and they were blind, absolutely blind. And it would get so frustrating to try to tell someone, this is who you are, and they wouldn't hear it. And so that's, I think, how sometimes maybe the Lord feels, is that he's trying to tell us who we are, and sometimes we don't believe him. And the first place is just to believe him in what he says about you. So don't rearm the enemy in your life. You don't need any of his interference by following the law. So Colossians uses the phrase shadow of things to come as well to refer to the Mosaic law observance. In fact, Paul goes even further and lets us know that not only have we been forgiven because he canceled the record of debt against us with its legal demands, but he also disarmed the rulers and authorities. So the Torah very clearly was a shadow of the reality to come. So the word or the phrase to come in the Greek means to occur at a point of time in the future, which is subsequent or comes after another event and is closely related to it. In other words, the coming of Jesus Christ as a perfect sacrifice and the only one who could not only fulfill all of the law and the prophets, but also take the punishment, is the after event to the law. Okay? So you got the law, Jesus Christ is the next event after it. Why? Because the law could not give us a new nature.
Right.
It couldn't. So the God had to become man. In fact, if you start trying to follow the law after you get a new nature, you'll start going backwards. In Galatians 5:4, it says you've fallen from grace. Going back to the law basically means grace is inoperative in your life. And that's one thing you don't want inoperative, because grace is the inner work of the Holy Spirit that begins to manifest itself outwardly. It says that the law was a faint shadow of the true form of these realities. These realities are all the things that Paul has been discussing so far, and the superiority of Jesus Christ and his covenant. The word form here is icon. E-I-K-O-N, where we get the term icon, I-C-O-N, in the Greek. And it means to be like, a representation, an image, or a likeness. However, it's also used with another word, and I've got it written there in your notes, that can refer to earthly copies and resemblances of archetype things in the heavens. So here's what this means. The distinction is that an icon, there always has to be a prototype. You can't have an icon without a prototype. A prototype is the before type. What does this mean? The tabernacle, the law, the utensils, the priesthood, all of that had to have a prototype. So that's why Moses built all of that according to the pattern that was shown to him when he received the law. So all of that was an earthly representation of what was in God's mind. But here's the thing. How do you take what is spirit and make it earthly? You see what I mean? He had to translate spiritual realities into something that man could see, right? And interact with. There had to be an ark. There had to be the table of showbread and the incense of prayer and all of these things, even the outer court, the inner court, the most holy court, all of those things were a prophetic picture. So that's why you have, out of all of the woods, why did he say for the post it has to be acacia wood? Why? Did you ever wonder that?
It was already that way. I can't remember.
Acacia wood represents the flesh because it's the most difficult to work with.
I figured.
Humanity. But then he covered it in gold, which gold is divinity, right?
Right.
So, I mean, all of it, the type of material, the colors that he used, everything was a picture of what he was going to do in Jesus Christ. That's why it's so crucial to interpret the old through the new. And that's why we spend so much time in the new, because then all of the old makes sense. Like you have people, well, God, he's mean because in the Old Testament he killed women and children and animals. Well, the reason that had to occur is because giants.
Yeah.
He had to get rid of tribes that had giants because they weren't the full thing, right?
They're hybrids.
They were hybrids. And so there's so many things that if you don't have the Holy Spirit, you will interpret the word completely wrong and interpret his nature completely wrong. So there had to be a prototype. The prototype was Jesus Christ. So everything was drawn from a source, which is why the law is holy, but it could make us holy. We had to have a new nature. It's that simple. So all these things prophesy of Jesus Christ, but unlike Jesus, none of them could remove the guilt of sin because of the sin nature, no matter how many sacrifices were offered or laws kept. And remember, perfect means perfect in a moral sense. We learned that last week. Now also, don't miss what Paul said in verses 2 through 3. He said, if animal sacrifices could once and for all eliminate sin, there would have been no need for it, right?
Right.
So he says that. But also, he says, and if that was the case, then it would have removed the guilt of sin or given us a clean conscience. Dead works are anything that's done not in faith.
I think we need to remember that really the first converts in Mass after Jesus died were the priest.
Mm-hmm.
They understood the symbolism of the veil being rent and some of the other things that had happened
Right.
because of their background and stuff. They understood it. And now we're trying to go back
It's
to
crazy.
what they left.
Well, and it
basically.
started not long after the Lord. Hebrews is written to combat that, to the Hebrews, right? Galatians was written to that region because the Judaizers, from the start, there was a method that was executed to try to get Christians connected to the law. In fact, Paul standing up to it and Peter standing up to it is what saved us from just being an addition to the Jewish sect of legalism. If it wasn't for them saying, no, you're not going to put that on the Gentiles, we wouldn't have what we have today. And so from the very beginning, not even 50 years later, that's what was coming in. Why? Because when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it made performance-based living and legalism and religious thought, which is a form without power and routine without relationship, right? That's what religion is. It made it comfortable and normal. And so we've been trained in our soul to live that way. And that's why a lot of times after we're born again, like I knew I was going to hell. I just need someone to help me not go there. So get born again, get spirit filled, and it's like the soul wants to go back to what is it
Well,
feels
that's-
normal,
that's
but
what I
also
was
it's an
thinking.
ego thing.
I was thinking that, if you have 5,000 priests that leave,
Mhm.
then their whole identity is gone.
Oh yeah,
It's
yeah.
stripped.
yeah,
And they are floating around out there without an oar, basically, because everything that they had put their whole life on, their whole, that whole tribe
yep.
of Levi, their whole identity was based on the law.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden that's cut out from under you, and you are,
Which is why Paul said he counted that all of that is rubbish,
Right.
because he was high up.
right?
He was high up, and he gave it all up.
But you can kind of understand they were just like, okay, now what do we do? Now what do we got to do?
Yeah. What does that look like?
Yeah.
I mean, it took them about 20-something years to figure that out in the early church. Okay, so the sacrifices could not give us a clean conscience. And you notice that Paul used the word worshiper. What is the Father seeking? Those who worship in spirit and truth. If you want to worship him in spirit and truth, you cannot have a guilty conscience. It won't happen. Because the guilty conscience is in the soul. So whatever you focus on, that's how you live, right? So if you try to worship him with a guilty conscience, you won't be able to do it. So that's why Jesus' blood gets that out of the way, so that you can come to Father with a boldness, not worried that he's going to squish you or punish you or any of that stuff. He'll handle his business if he needs to. But I think sometimes we add to things that aren't even a problem. So Christ's sacrifice eliminates sin. What does that mean for us? Well, in the English Standard Version of Hebrews 10, 1 through 4, it's translated that he eliminates sin or any consciousness of sins. Adam and Eve did not have a consciousness of sin until they ate from the tree. Okay? So, if you think about the Lord and that he's the last Adam, that's a very interesting title. So you have the first Adam, you have the last Adam. Why is he called the last Adam? Because he came to restore the pre-fallen state. The pre-fallen state is, there's no separation between you and God. You don't have to live in a consciousness of sin. You live in a consciousness of God. It's that simple.
Right.
You're always aware of him. Like even when you're doing stuff that maybe doesn't seem like it goes with them. Like when we do our true crime podcast, he's on my mind. Constant. Sometimes I might say a little word and have to, sorry, Lord. Because when you study these people, just, So sometimes I have to do that. But it is, I'm always thinking of that, of him. And so that's what it is to live like that. But another thing, when, you get restored to the pre-fallen state in Jesus Christ, of course your body, that will be restored at the resurrection. But they didn't have poverty. They didn't have division in the relationships with one another. They didn't have pain in childbirth. Y'all have all heard me tell the story of Cindy, 2 babies, no labor whatsoever. I mean, all of those things were restored, and yet we live as if we're still in a fallen state.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? And a lot of that's because of stuff that's been preached from the pulpit, which makes me irritated. It would make so much more sense if we would preach identity and redemption realities. If that was the case, we wouldn't have as many Christians still messed up. So Jesus came to restore us back to a state of no consciousness of sin. Well, then people are like, well, does that mean that you're not ever tempted? Are you saying you're sinless? Well, positionally, yes. However, we don't live in a fake reality. We understand that we're still tempted at times. So is Jesus. It didn't make him a sinner.
Right.
A lot of people equate being tempted to sin with sinning. No. Because again, it says that he was tempted in all points just like us, yet without sin, right?
Yeah, he didn't act on it.
He didn't
You have
act
to
on
commit
it.
a crime before it's called a crime.
Right. So being tempted to sin, here's the way I look at it. Those, like arrows that point you in a certain direction? Like sometimes when I'm tempted to sin, it's so ridiculous, I laugh. But other times, I'm like, that might have hit a little too close to home. That's a sign to me. I flip it around. Okay, so the fact that you tempted me in that means that may be something that I need to pray about and get some word on, right? and shut that door. Because we know in the Amplified Bible, when the enemy came and he said, it's evident by the divine essence in you that you are the Son of God, right? In the Luke chapter 4 in the Weiss translation, it brings that out. The enemy knew he was the Son of God. He then tempts him 3 times. And in the Amplified it says that the enemy then stood afar off, waiting for a more opportune time to tempt him again. What are those opportune times? Just hit me with a couple.
When you're weak.
Tired, weak, like physically or
Yeah,
mentally.
physically or mentally.
What else?
Oh, bad company.
Bad company, hungry. That's why I snack, you know. And stuff. What else? Angry. Yeah. So he always, if you're sick, if you're weak, if you're going through something, if you hear bad news, whatever it is, like the Lord when he heard about his cousin, John, he wanted to mourn. He wanted to get away from the crowds so he could process the fact that his family member died. But he couldn't because all the crowds were coming at him. The enemy was throwing everything he had at him. You know what I mean? The night he sweat blood,
Yeah.
Because the Lord, I think what really impacted him that night, because it is a medical condition where you can be so stressed that your capillaries burst. And I don't think he was stressed and like, oh, I'm so stressed. I think he was the battle on the inside. And here's what I think the battle was. They had in Jewish tradition 4 cups. And the 3rd cup, if I'm not mistaken, was the one he had a drink out of. And that was a cup of suffering. I don't think it was the suffering that bothered him. What I think it was being divided from his father for the first time in his life. He'd never been separated from the father. He'd never been separated. So the thought that he was going to have to be separated, I think, really weighed heavily on him. And then we know there was a lot of warfare going on that night because, sometimes when you get hit with a lot of stuff, you want to sleep, right? And his disciples kept falling asleep.
Yeah.
And he'd go to them, and then he said something very interesting for those that like to escape. He said, you need to watch and pray so that you're not tempted.
Right.
And that's what he was doing. Because if he had not, the Lord did not win the battle on the cross. The Lord won the battle in the garden. The battle was lost in the garden with Adam and Eve. Right? So by the time he won the battle in the garden, everything else was just etc. He was able to do it. The movie The Passion, very difficult movie to watch, but my favorite part is when his mom goes running up to him. Because he fell, remember, because of the cross? And he hugged it. He hugged the cross. He said, this is why I came. I'm going to make all things new. And that gets me every time. He wouldn't have been able to do that. He wouldn't have been able to have that except for the joy